The great debt problem. This is a problem everybody in the world now these days is looking at. For more on that, we are joined by George Sogopoulos from Greece. He is actually in Athens. And meanwhile, we also have in Berlin, Mr. Joseph Yannin with us. And at the same time, in New York, we have Max Wolf, professor of economics from the New School University. Welcome to the three of you. For now, I would like to begin by asking our Greek panelists, what exactly are we looking at? We understand minutes before our show, Greece already submitted creditors a new two-year proposal. This is at the time when it's going to default on the IMF bailout plan. So, Mr. Paulos, help us understand what's going on here. We probably have some problems coming from Greece. We'll have our technicians to figure those out. Mr. Yannin, so maybe you can help us to understand this last-minute proposal coming from Greece about what to do with the IMF bailout plan default.
Well, it's basically two messages. The first message is the Greek government does still want to negotiate. So it does still want to get back to the table. So it's basically taken up the offer of the open door for further negotiations. But secondly, it insists on getting an immediately effected debt relief by rolling over its current debt now outstanding to the IMF over to the European Stability Mechanism, which is an offer that the others in the eurozone will not accept. Because it would be a departure of their fundamental policy. But for the time being, it indicates that the government still tries to find a way out of that situation.
And also, we are looking at some other issues because Greece is going to vote on the referendum by the weekend. Many people believe this is another way of postponing all the deadlines and the possibilities. What do you think, Mr. Yannin?
Well, you know, we're already past the essential deadline,
right,
which is now the repayment of the loan to the IMF. So I think it is an indication that the Greek negotiation strategy has reached a dead-end point. And by calling a referendum, the Tsipras government is trying to get itself a new mandate, to get itself a new position which should strengthen it in the negotiations. Whether it does that is questionable because the whole process and calling a referendum suddenly at the end of an intense negotiation process does not increase the trust in his government by his EU partners.
Not at all. Mr. Sogopoulos from Greece, probably you can help us understand even better. What do you think will be the voice of the voters when they vote for that referendum? Will they think about their own lives mainly? Will they think about the credibility of their country's economy? Will they think about what their politicians want them to do, which is to vote no, so that the politicians will have stronger negotiating basis when they face creditors elsewhere in Europe as well as from IMF? Mr. Sogopoulos.
Good afternoon from Athens. Thank you for giving me this opportunity in the most dramatic moments in the modern history of Greece. I should say that there is one word which now describes the situation, and this is uncertainty. Uncertainty for both the government and for citizens themselves, who since yesterday live in a different country with capital controls imposed and also with banks closed. The Greek Prime Minister is making a last effort to negotiate in Brussels, but the problem is that his credibility has collapsed in the previous 5 days. So we are now in the moment where we are expecting what will happen, but since yesterday we are experiencing as Greek citizens, as normal Greek citizens, the pain of bankruptcy, and this leads me to the observation that the only solution now for the government is to cooperate with the European Union and accept the bailout deal offered by the President of the European Commission. Otherwise, the situation will be worse and worse in the next days.
But let's just ask you, from the bottom of your heart, Mr. Sokopoulos, what do you think might be the future? Is there going to be a Grexit, as they say? Because obviously the two sides are very diverse in what they can offer and what they can accept. Mr. Sokopoulos.
Well, the government should accept the bailout deal. Otherwise, it will lead Greece to a normal bankruptcy, as it is happening since yesterday, and the consequences for normal citizens will be dramatic. This is what it needs to happen right now. And from that moment, then possibly Greek citizens on Sunday can say either no to the proposals of the government or yes to the eurozone. And this is right now what is very important for Greece. Greece needs to remain a part of the eurozone, and then we can see whether the government or a new government can renegotiate with its partners.
Right.
But we are talking now about a moment of survival.
It is a moment of survival. What is going to be the result of this moment of survival? That's what we are extremely interested in. Mr. Yanning, before I go to the other panelists from the US, let me ask you about the EU's thought, because many say no matter what might be the mistakes, the fails to offer plans from Greece, eventually EU still really wants to have the Greece to stick to the bloc. It is extremely important for the EU politically, economically, and of course for its future. Do you think that the EU can now, after all of this drama, give up Greece? Mr. Yanning.
You're asking Mr.
Yes.
Wolf in New York or me?
Mr. Yanning.
Oh, you know, politically, it's an integrity issue. The majority of eurozone member states want to keep this eurozone together, don't want a single country to fail, because their vision still is that at the end of the day, all EU member states, and even some far day away, even the United Kingdom, will be united under one currency. So for that matter, the others are willing to consider a high political price and extra efforts, extra negotiating miles to make that happen. But unfortunately, the EU as an incomplete political union does not have the means to bring about the kind of results inside a single member state, such as Greece, that it would need in order to extend more help, which is rather thorough, fundamental structural reforms, and not just a range of cuts here and there, but is to actually rebuild the public sector of Greece to a quality that the Greek people deserve.
Certainly complicated picture. Shall I go to you, Professor Wolf? Thank you for patiently waiting, but we need to let the Europeans to figure out something before we go to you. For the Americans and the rest of the world, what does it mean, this very last minute? Shall we say we're repeating ourselves very last minute?
Sure. So thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to join you. I think the world watches here, and we try to figure out if the European Union is a union, even when one country finds itself in a situation, while quite difficult, that violates the orthodoxies of the IMF and the ECB. What I think we're seeing here is a clash between the reality of the hardship in Greece and to some extent in other parts of Europe versus the ideology that guides institutions like the IMF and the ECB. And it's always a bit tragic to see a solution not happen when it could, in part as folks cling to an orthodoxy. And let's be honest here, the ECB and IMF medicine has been a total and absolute across-the-board failure for the Greek economy, which is part of the reason that you don't have the will, politically or on the streets in Athens, to do the things that the ECB and IMF ask, even when those things are in fact good suggestions and might result in structural reform. Most people see a society with a 25% fall in GDP, 25% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, and they're in way too much pain to drink more bitter tasting medicine to fit with somebody else's plan for their country.
But the thing is, Professor Wolf, what are the other alternatives? There are no other alternatives. They have to accept the plan so that the economy can, in a way, still on its track. This is a good proposal, as you have mentioned as well. So it seems that the international mechanism does not necessarily fit into the crisis that we are facing once and again. Whose problem is it? Individual countries or the international mechanism's problem? Your thoughts?
So it's a great question. It's both, right? The problem is if the international mechanism fails as completely and as often as it has here, then there is something wrong with the international mechanism. That being said, following that broken mechanism, however painful, is probably the best option. But it is very, very difficult to ask people to do that. In fact, that's how we got Keynesian macro policy, which is hard to do, as Mr. Yanning said, if you only have monetary and not fiscal policy union. But the bottom line is, if you tell people it'll get better in the long run, in the short run it's painful, Keynes gave us a good lesson with the famous quote, in the long run we're all dead. This medicine has been so painful and so unsuccessful that getting the people to follow it has become politically impossible inside Greece and politically impossible to not do outside Greece.
Well, it depends on what kind of political system we're talking about and structural mechanism we're talking about. Mr. Yanning, what do you make of Professor Wolf's remarks concerning international mechanism vis-a-vis realities in Greece and also the EU countries?
Well, I see his point, but there are other cases. Ireland has done better. Spain is doing better. Portugal is doing better. It's not to belittle that there is still quite some work to do. And the Irish, the Spanish, and the Portuguese have suffered greatly also. But at least there is a response. I think what the essential weakness of what Wolf calls the IMF or ECB orthodoxy is that it is like the controlling department in a big company. They are the guys with the red ink. They are sent out to cut costs everywhere, and they are just cutting those costs. The real thing is not to cut some costs there, but is to find a mode of organizing the public sector that is more efficient, that is more effective, and that is more than just taking some money out.
The structural debate certainly is taking place for our German and also American guests, but for our Greek guests, this is a death and life situation. Mr. Sokopoulos, what do you think will be the next, if you could anticipate? First of all, credibility of your prime minister, both internally and also within the EU, how much will that have on the real negotiating result? Secondly, after the referendum, do you think the country can be, unlike before, not postponing anymore, but rather face up to the issues that you really have to look at this moment? Mr. Sokopoulos.
Well, let me say that the Europeans have combined the result of the referendum with a yes or no vote to the euro. So they have said that practically they will go on with negotiations with the government if the answer will be yes. Otherwise, they have already shown that they are not prepared to make more compromise. What is lacking in Greece is that the political leadership of the country needs to be united and say the truth to the Greek citizens. Without the support of the society, it is impossible to go on right now. And this government is negotiating in a way which is providing important differences within the society itself.
Right.
So what I am expecting is a compromise.
Compromise. Okay, what time, to what extent? Of course, those are the most important questions. Mr. Yanning and Professor Wolf, before we go, very brief question to both of you. If, let's just talk about a very different scenario, Greece leaves the EU, what does it mean for the EU after all of these months and years of discussions and negotiations? Mr. Yanning, briefly from you first.
Well, if Greece leaves the EU altogether, it will still need the solidarity of other Europeans because it will be in deep trouble for quite some time. So Europe will still be with Greece.
I see. Professor Wolf, what does it mean for the others, Americans, for example?
I would agree with that. I think, look, the bottom line is that Greece's future is Europe, and Europe's future includes Greece, whether or not it's in the European monetary mechanism and the eurozone. It will be a symbolic defeat and setback, and it will remind the world how far out of whack things can get and how fast. And that will be a painful and negative memory refreshed for everyone all over the world with their own local reference case.
Max Wolf in New York, Joseph Yanning in Berlin, and George Solopoulos in Greece. In fact, in the Greece capital Athens with us. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. It is certainly not just a debate about economic and structures. It is also a debate about life and death for a country. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.